If You Have Nightmares, We'll Dance on the Bed by Lefay, Strent. Chapter 7. Warnings for this chapter for blood and violence. Virgil remembered the first time he'd ever seen a human. It had been a young girl. Not quite a woman yet, but the skin of childhood was quickly shedding. She had a basket hung in the crook of an elbow. Words fell from her lips, voice not quite lilting enough for song. She recited softly to herself as she picked rocks from the river. It had been by chance Virgil had spotted her. His careful nature made him more prone to the thickest areas of the forest. Today, though, he found himself wandering in search of food. The girl must not have heard the stories of the fair folk. That or she didn't believe in them. It had been a time before war, a time when humans, especially the ones tucked away safely in their bustling cities, were more inclined to liken the Fae to myths. Virgil glimpsed her through the trees across the river. He should have run as soon as he saw her. He didn't. The girl wasn't even carrying a weapon. Virgil could sense nothing magical about her. She had no defenses to speak of, and yet she carried on as if she had nothing to fear, bold in her vulnerability. And she smiled to herself. She picked rocks out of the river, throwing more back into the water than she placed in her basket. She had been so lucky that it had been Virgil who had found her. Virgil who slunk around in the shadows because light made you easy to find, easy to kill. It wasn't like Virgil to interact with anyone if he could absolutely help it. But here he found himself wanting to sit beside her, to ask what brought her out so far, to know what purpose the little stones would serve, to hear the story behind the words she recited. Virgil remembered that first encounter so clearly, the memory seared into his brain. He remembered watching the girl eventually leave. He remembered the day she came back shortly after with another girl who looked too similar to be anything other than her sister. He remembered the way they trotted down that same river bank, scouring the area for little treasures, laughing and teasing each other. He remembered never seeing the sisters again, but several more humans would venture into or around the forest. Virgil remembered growing more daring, spending as much time as he could watching these creatures that looked so similar to himself, yet were infinitely different. He remembered learning to treasure them. He did what he could without being seen, helping them to find what they were looking for, guiding those that were lost. It made him feel close, connected. He couldn't stand alongside them, nor could he ever be them. Them, these humans, so vivid in their warmth and deep in their delights. Virgil remembered their happiness and wishing it was his own. Virgil remembered so many things that broke his heart and gave it reason to beat all at once. But if Virgil was being honest, he couldn't remember ever being hugged. A sad realization to make in the middle of an emotional breakdown, wasn't it? But screw it, Virgil thought he was seconds away from dying. Still thought he would die soon. And here this little human had snuck in to show him kindness and concern when no one else had. He made Virgil feel like his life had actually been worth a damn. And here Virgil was, frightening that very child by the onslaught of his emotional upheaval. He couldn't understand exactly why Virgil wept, and his sympathetic nature caused him to begin to cry in return. Despite how distressed Thomas grew, Virgil couldn't stop. "I'm sorry," he told the prince, rocking them back and forth. "I'm sorry for what the others put you through. I'm sorry that I couldn't stop them from taking your parents. I'm sorry I waited until now to do anything. I was scared. I'm sorry. I'm sorry they came here last night. I'm sorry I couldn't protect everyone. I'm so sorry, little one." If anyone in this world deserved better than the lot they had received, it was this kind soul in his arms. The other humans were arguing with each other. Virgil didn't care to listen. He just wanted this moment, this one moment for himself. There was no way out for him. This was it. Each potential escape method was smashed to bits by the looming notion that he had nowhere to go. Back to the forest? No, he'd be hunted by his own kind. Lose himself in Selbion? The humans would hunt him down just the same. And Virgil doubted he could make it beyond their borders, weak as he was now. He couldn't even make it beyond the border of the Enchanted Circle. The only foreseeable way he could manage that in his condition would be to take advantage of Thomas. He had just enough of his name to influence him, or failing that, try to make a deal with him. But just thinking about attempting to hobble through the castle made Virgil bone-deep tired. So this was it. "Unhand him," Roman's voice commanded. Virgil could feel the sharpness of a blade poised right at his neck. Despite the sword's length, Roman would have had to step into the circle to reach him. Virgil clenched his eyes closed tighter and held fast to Thomas. "I said let him go!" Roman yelled, and suddenly Thomas was being yanked out of his arms. "No, please," Virgil begged. The cold air lapped at his chest and accentuated the emptiness of his arms. His hands flew out to catch Thomas, but Roman's eyes blazed bright and his sword ignited with flame. Virgil reared back instinctively to avoid being singed. That was all Roman needed to stumble out of the circle. The fire fizzled out, leaving behind hot steel, and Roman sagged considerably where he held Thomas. Sweat glinted on his brow, and his skin paled. The general was not as recovered as he seemed to be. 2 seconds. That's how long it took for Virgil's brief respite to be taken away. A devastated wail curled up in his throat, and he lunged forward, driven by the madness of someone who didn't have anything left to lose. As soon as Virgil's body neared the circle's perimeter, all the drawn sigils sparked in yellow electricity. The piercing current jolted through Virgil, and he choked on a scream. His body fell back, muscles spasming and refusing to work properly. "You hurt him! You hurt him!" Thomas's shrill voice screeched. Dazedly, Virgil looked up from his slumped position on the floor to watch Thomas batter little fists into Roman. Roman winced and struggled to hold the prince. He dropped his sword to keep the boy from flailing into it. Calm down," Roman told him. But Patton stood there off to the side, eyes wide and watching Virgil with an unidentifiable expression. His lips were pressed thin and white while staring at the broken Fay. "You're a jerk!" Thomas screeched again. "You hurt him! He's my friend and you hurt him! Let me go!" "Patton, help me, man!" Patton couldn't tear his gaze away from Virgil. Fresh blood seeped into the previously white bandages wrapped around Virgil's chest. His wound had come open, and Virgil could hardly decipher it amongst all the rest of the pain that racked his body. This was so much worse, prolonging the agony, hearing Thomas's screams and being able to do nothing about it, knowing that the child would probably weep for him after he died, despite Virgil not feeling deserving of the honor in the slightest. His body wouldn't cooperate. A sinking, grasping sensation dragged at his insides, at his awareness. Maybe he would bleed out at this rate, save the general from having to come over here and kill Virgil himself. His fingers twitched as he tried to touch at his wound, but in the end he laid still. Roman hollered as Thomas sunk his teeth into his forearm. The boy was dropped and wasted no time in scurrying over to Virgil. Just as he made it, a shroud of thundering dark blue clouds condensed by the open doorway. Logan walked out of them dressed in his sleepwear, his glasses slightly askew. "What is going on here?" The wizard surveyed the disorder. "Verge! Mr. Verge!" Thomas called to him. He dropped to his knees beside Virgil, hands shaking at his shoulder. Tears and snot covered his reddened face. Virgil's world narrowed down to this one human, this child who called him friend. "It's okay. I'm not going to let him hurt you again." The child hiccuped through another bout of tears. "Logan can fix you, and then you can stay and live with me in the castle, okay? But you have to get better. Get better and you can stay, okay?" Virgil's head spun, and unconsciousness threatened to take him, but he wouldn't let Thomas be taken from him a second time, not after he'd finally found something that made all the misery in his life worth it. Thomas was offering him a hand, and Virgil would gladly cling to it. "Promise I can stay with you?" Virgil asked. "I promise," Thomas said, and scooped Virgil's hand up to twine their pinkies together. Virgil closed his eyes. "It's a deal, then." Virgil's awareness slipped away right then, but to everyone else in the room they would forever remember what they witnessed. Virgil's body erupted in a sea of shadows. The first wave sprouted out like inky vines, the tendrils circling around Thomas and slamming Roman back, who had been just about to reach them. The boy leaned back to watch as the writhing shadows descended on him, covering his skin and encapsulating him entirely. Logan threw out a spell, but it had no effect. The Fae had completely turned into shadows, and nothing could stop the shadows from consuming Thomas. And then, as they watched the pulsing black mass in horror, the shadows bled away. Patches of the prince emerged, locks of his hair, his fingers held up to hold nothing, the curve of his cheek. On and on the shadows were absorbed into Thomas's body until nothing remained. Once they were all gone, Thomas went limp.